I was nothing more than the backup plan for my troubled brother until I broke free. What happened next will shock you. I always felt like an unwanted spare part in a perfectly completed puzzle. Growing up, I knew deep down that I was never the main character in my family story. My name is Mallory, and for as long as I can remember, I was the forgotten one in a household where everything revolved around my older brother, Brendan. He was 5 years ahead of me in age, and from the moment I was born, it was as though I had disrupted some delicate balance he had carefully crafted for himself. Brendan had ADHD, and while I now understand how difficult that can make life, as a kid, all I saw was how every aspect of our home seemed to orbit around him. No one seemed to care how much his needs overshadowed mine. It started early. My parents, Elise and Roger, would always share these little stories about how Brendan would throw tantrums when I was a baby because, according to them, I was stealing all the attention. I don't remember those moments, of course, but my mom would laugh about them like they were amusing little family tales. "Oh, Brendan just didn't like sharing us," she'd say, smiling like it was some precious memory. To me, it never felt like a funny story. It sounded more like a subtle warning. By the time I was 4, I started noticing it myself. Brendan didn't just dislike me. He outright resented me. If I was playing with a toy, he'd snatch it away, not because he wanted it, but because he couldn't bear to see me enjoying myself. I would cry, naturally. What 4-year-old wouldn't? But my parents would just shake their heads, saying, "Brendan doesn't mean it, Mallory. He's just overwhelmed. Be patient with him." That word, patient, was burned into my brain as if I was the one failing by not understanding enough. My birthdays were always the worst. For most kids, birthdays are magical, a special day that's all about them. Not for me. Brendan made sure every single one of my birthdays was ruined. My 7th birthday stands out as a vivid memory. I had invited a small group of friends over, and just as we were about to cut the cake, Brendan stormed into the room. He'd been sulking all morning because the attention wasn't on him, and when I stood smiling for the camera next to my cake, he shoved the table so hard that the entire cake crashed to the floor. My friends stared in stunned silence, and I just froze, staring at the ruined mess of frosting and candles smeared on the carpet. Brendan didn't look sorry. In fact, he stood there with his arms crossed, glaring at me as if I'd somehow forced him to do it. My parents? They immediately rushed to comfort him. "It's okay, Brendan. We'll get you some ice cream," my mom said, pulling him aside like he was the one who needed consoling. I didn't even get the chance to cry before my dad started cleaning up, saying, "Don't be upset, Mallory. You know how Brendan is." That was it. No new cake, no acknowledgement of how much it hurt. My friends went home early, and I spent the rest of the day alone in my room. That was the day I learned a bitter truth. My feelings didn't matter. Not to my parents, not in our house. By the time I turned 9, Brendan's behavior had escalated. He was 14 by then, stronger, meaner, and more relentless. It wasn't just about toys anymore. If I was in his way, he'd shove me. If I was holding something, my homework, my lunch, he'd knock it out of my hands. One time, I was clutching a drawing I'd worked on for hours for art class. Brendan snatched it, crumpled it into a ball, and tossed it into the trash. When I told my mom, she didn't even bother looking up. "He's just being a big brother," she said casually. "You'll understand when you're older." I remember holding back tears, wondering what exactly I was supposed to understand. That Brendan could treat me like trash, and I just had to live with it? It wasn't just his actions that broke me. It was how my parents dismissed me every single time. If Brendan hit me, they'd comfort him, saying he didn't mean it. If I screamed in frustration, I'd get scolded for being dramatic. I'd cry quietly in my room, questioning myself. Was I too sensitive? Was I overreacting? But deep down, I knew the truth. Brendan was a bully, and my parents let him get away with it. The most vivid memory I have of those years came when I was 10. I'd been working on a science fair project for weeks. It was the first time I felt genuinely proud of something. When my teacher told me I might win, I was ecstatic. That night at dinner, I shared the news with my parents, hoping for just a shred of encouragement. Brendan, of course, couldn't stand it. No one cares about your dumb project, he muttered under his breath. I tried to ignore him, but I saw the look in his eyes, the same look he always had when he was about to destroy something that mattered to me. I left my project on the kitchen table that night. The next morning it was gone. The poster was torn to shreds, and the model I'd built was smashed to pieces. I found Brendan lounging on the couch, watching TV like nothing had happened. "Why would you do this?" I shouted, tears streaming down my face. He smirked and shrugged. My mom walked in, saw the mess, and immediately turned to me. "Mallory, don't yell at your brother. You know how easily he gets upset." Upset? I was the one in tears. I was the one who had spent weeks pouring my heart into that project, and it was destroyed. But once again, Brendan's feelings came first. My parents didn't punish him. They didn't even tell him he was wrong. Instead, my mom handed me a roll of paper towels and told me to clean up the mess. By the time I was 12, I stopped asking my parents for help. It was easier to keep my head down and avoid Brendan than to hope they'd ever take my side. I became quiet, withdrawn. My friends noticed. They asked why I never invited them over anymore, but what could I say? That my brother hated me? That my parents didn't care? I couldn't explain it, so I just made excuses. Even at school, where I should have felt free, I carried the weight of it. Teachers praised me for being so well-behaved or mature for my age, but the truth was simpler. I had just learned how to make myself invisible. I had mastered the art of making myself small, barely taking up space, because living with Brendan had taught me that it was safer to disappear. By the time I was 12, I didn't have the words to describe it, but I felt like I was constantly drowning. I dreamed of having a normal family, one where siblings might argue but still cared for each other. I longed for parents who truly saw me, who noticed when I was struggling. Instead, I got Brendan, the sun around which everything revolved, and parents who made me feel like a shadow. I didn't realize it at the time, but those years of being invisible were shaping me in ways I wouldn't fully understand until later. They were also sowing the first seeds of my eventual escape. By 13, I had stopped hoping that things might change. Brendan, now 18, had grown stronger, and his bullying had escalated to something deliberate and calculated. It wasn't just teasing or shoving anymore. Everything he did was infused with an awareness that he would face no consequences. My parents continued their pattern of coddling him, excusing his behavior as though it were some unchangeable law of nature. One day, just before I started high school, I was sitting at the dining room table, working on a summer project. I had carefully arranged my notes and papers when Brendan walked by and casually swept everything to the floor. My work lay crumpled around me as I froze, staring at the mess. Brendan just smirked and said, "Oops, you shouldn't have put it there." His voice dripped with mock innocence. I snapped. "Why do you always do this?" I shouted, my voice trembling with frustration. Brendan didn't even acknowledge my anger. He just laughed and strolled out of the room. I was still picking up the scattered papers when my mom walked in. She sighed, exasperated. "Mallory, don't be so dramatic. I'm sure it wasn't on purpose. You know how Brendan is." That line, "You know how Brendan is," echoed in my head like a cruel refrain. I'd heard it so many times by then that it felt like the family motto. Brendan didn't just torment me at home. His troubles extended to school as well, though my parents were in complete denial about it. He constantly got into trouble, talking back to teachers, refusing to do assignments, picking fights with classmates. Every time the principal called, my parents would find some excuse for his behavior. "Brendan's trying his best," my dad would say, as if those words could erase all the damage he caused. "He just needs a little extra patience." Brendan didn't have many friends, so my parents often tried to force friendships on him. It never worked. One afternoon, when I was 14, my mom brought over a coworker's son, a quiet boy named Josh, hoping he and Brendan would get along. It was a disaster. Brendan mocked Josh for being shy, then hurled a basketball at his face, so hard it made his nose bleed. Josh ran out of the house in tears, but instead of holding Brendan accountable, my mom spent the evening comforting him. "You didn't mean it," she kept telling him. "It's okay. You just got frustrated." She didn't even acknowledge the harm he'd caused, and that was always how it went. Meanwhile, I retreated further into myself. I spent most of my time in my room, buried in books or hiding behind my headphones to escape the chaos. At school, I was the quiet kid, the one who avoided trouble and never made waves. My teachers called me mature, but I knew better. I wasn't mature. I was just exhausted. I had learned early on that staying invisible was the safest option. By this point, I had stopped trying to talk to my parents about Brendan altogether. They had never taken me seriously, and I had no energy left to fight. One evening, when I was 15, Brendan and I were watching TV in the living room. I reached for the remote to change the channel, but Brendan yanked it out of my hand so hard that I tumbled off the couch. My head hit the edge of the coffee table, leaving me dazed and in pain. Brendan sat back, completely unfazed, a smirk on his face. Later that night, I told my mom what had happened. She didn't even look up from her phone. "Mallory, you need to stop provoking him," she said flatly. "You know how Brendan gets." That night, I cried into my pillow, feeling utterly alone. For the first time, I realized that my parents weren't just blind to Brendan's behavior. They were actively choosing not to see it. They didn't want to face the truth, so they let me bear the brunt of it. The breaking point came when I was 16. It was supposed to be a good day, one of the best days of my life. My history teacher had nominated me for a state academic award after months of hard work, and I was so proud of myself. I came home eager to share the news, hoping for even a sliver of praise. My mom gave me a distracted smile. "That's nice, Mallory," she said before turning back to Brendan, who was in the middle of complaining about how unfair his teachers were. Brendan didn't say anything at first, but I caught him watching me with that familiar, dangerous look in his eyes. Later that night, he barged into my room uninvited. "Why do you always have to act like you're so perfect?" he sneered. I didn't know how to respond, so I stayed silent. Brendan grabbed the certificate I had left on my desk, tore it in half, and let the pieces flutter to the floor before walking out. The next morning, I told my dad. He shook his head and said, "Mallory, you know Brendan's going through a hard time. Don't take it personally." But how could I not take it personally? Brendan had destroyed something I'd worked so hard for, and my dad's response was to tell me not to make a fuss. That moment hurt more than any shove or insult Brendan had ever thrown my way because it confirmed what I'd always feared. My parents would never defend me. I was just collateral damage in their unwavering effort to protect Brendan. By then, my grandparents were the only people I could turn to. My mom's parents, Evelyn and George, were kind and understanding in a way my parents never were. I started spending more time at their house, escaping for a few hours whenever I could. My grandma would sit with me at the kitchen table, pouring me a cup of tea and letting me talk. She never interrupted, never dismissed my feelings. She just listened. One day, after I told her about Brendan tearing up my award, she reached across the table and took my hand. "You don't deserve this, Mallory," she said softly. "You're not wrong for wanting more." Those words stayed with me. I wasn't wrong for wanting more. I wasn't wrong for feeling hurt or for wanting to be seen. For years, I had been made to feel like I was the problem, like I was too sensitive or selfish for wanting my parents to notice me. But in that moment, I began to see the truth. I deserved better. I wanted my parents to care about me as much as they cared about Brendan, but my grandma's words gave me a tiny spark of hope. They planted the idea that maybe I wasn't wrong for wanting more. Slowly, I began to imagine a future where I didn't have to tiptoe around my own house or shrink myself just to keep the peace. I didn't know how I'd do it, but I made myself a promise. I wasn't going to live my entire life feeling like this. Somehow, some way, I was going to break free. For the first time in years, I started to believe it might actually happen. By the time I was 17, the resentment I felt toward my family was like a weight pressing down on me every second of the day. It wasn't just Brendan anymore. His bullying had become so ingrained in our lives that it felt routine. What hurt even more was my parents' constant refusal to acknowledge it. I'd spent my entire existence being an afterthought in a house that revolved entirely around Brendan. And I was done pretending I could endure it. Leaving wasn't just a dream anymore. It was my survival plan. I knew I couldn't just move across town or attend a local college where my parents would guilt me into coming home every weekend to help with Brendan. No, I needed a complete, clean break, miles between us, enough distance to finally breathe. So I started planning my escape like a military operation. Every night after finishing my homework, I sat at my desk researching colleges, specifically ones as far away as possible from our small town in Missouri. I looked at schools in California, New York, Oregon, any place that felt like a world away from here. I didn't dare tell my parents what I was doing. I couldn't risk them interfering because I knew they'd never understand. They would never support my decision to leave, not when they saw me as an integral part of Brendan's care. It didn't take long for them to notice something was up. One evening, my dad knocked on my bedroom door and poked his head in. "You've been quiet lately," he said, like it was some strange new behavior. "I've just been busy with school," I replied, keeping my tone calm and even. I didn't want to give him any reason to dig deeper. He stared at me for a moment like he was trying to read my mind, but eventually shrugged and left. I exhaled in relief. As far as they were concerned, I was the good kid, the one they didn't have to worry about. And I worked hard to keep it that way because being ignored was better than being scrutinized. I poured myself into my schoolwork, determined to earn the grades I needed for a scholarship. Our family didn't have much money, and I knew my parents wouldn't help pay for college, not after I told them I wanted to leave. To help fund my escape, I got a part-time job at a local diner, saving every penny I could. It wasn't much, but it was mine. A few months later, once I had gathered enough information, I began submitting college applications. My heart raced every time I hit submit. Each one felt like a lifeline, a step closer to freedom. I didn't know if I'd be accepted anywhere, but I had to try. Eventually, the moment came when I couldn't keep my plans a secret anymore. We were sitting at the dinner table, Mom, Dad, Brendan, and me. Brendan was in the middle of another rant, complaining about how his teachers were making him redo a project he hadn't bothered to finish. As usual, my parents nodded sympathetically. "They just don't understand how you learn," my mom said, her voice filled with the same enabling tone I'd heard my whole life. I stared down at my plate, trying to block out their voices, when my dad suddenly turned to me. "Mallory, you've been awfully quiet. What's going on with you?" For a second, I froze. I hadn't planned to bring it up yet, but something inside me snapped. I was tired of hiding. "I've been applying to colleges," I said, trying to sound casual. "Out of state." The room went silent. My mom's fork clattered against her plate. Brendan looked up from his phone, staring at me like I'd just announced I was moving to another planet. "Out of state," my mom repeated, her voice sharp. "Why would you want to go so far away?" I kept my eyes on my plate. "I just think it would be good for me," I said quietly. "I want to experience something new." My dad's face darkened. "What's wrong with staying here? There are great schools close to home." I took a deep breath, bracing myself. I need to get away. I need space." His expression hardened. "Space? Space from what?" Before I could answer, Brendan cut in with a sneer. "She just wants to act like she's better than us." "That's not true." I shot back, my voice rising despite myself. "I just want to live my own life for once." That's when my dad said something I'll never forget. He put down his fork, leaned forward, and said, "You know Brendan needs you here. You can't just leave him like that. We've always counted on you to help with him." My stomach twisted into knots. "Counted on me?" I asked, my voice trembling. Dad looked at me like I was being difficult. "Mallory, we've talked about this. Brendan struggles, and he's going to need you as he gets older. That's just the way it is. You're part of the family plan." Family plan. Those words hung in the air, suffocating me. My suspicions, the ones I'd tried so hard to ignore, were confirmed in that moment. I wasn't a person to them. I was a backup plan, a safety net for Brendan. Mom must have realized how much damage Dad's words had done because she quickly tried to smooth things over. "That's not what he meant," she said, her voice shaky. "Of course we love you. We need you to think about what's best for the family." I couldn't even look at her. I felt like I was going to be sick. "I'm not responsible for Brendan," I said quietly. I need to live my own life. Brendan rolled his eyes. Selfish much? I pushed my chair back and stood up. I'm not selfish, I said, my voice shaking with anger. I'm just done pretending that my life doesn't matter. Without waiting for a response, I walked away from the table. My parents called after me, but I didn't care. I went upstairs, shut my door, and sat on my bed, trying to process what had just happened. Dad's words echoed in my head. Family plan. It was as if my entire life had been mapped out without my consent. I wasn't Mallory, their daughter. I was Brendan's future caretaker. That night, I made a promise to myself. I didn't care what my parents said, and I didn't care how hard it was going to be. I was going to leave that house, that town, and all the baggage that came with it. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life cleaning up after Brendan. I wasn't going to let my family's expectations dictate my life anymore. This was my future, and for the first time, I was determined to fight for it. The months that followed were a blur of grit and exhaustion. I poured everything I had into my schoolwork and my shifts at the diner, knowing I needed scholarships and every penny I could save to make my escape a reality. The plan became an obsession. I stayed up late studying, applied for every scholarship I could find, and worked long hours after school. My parents barely noticed. They were too preoccupied with Brendan, who was now 18 but doing absolutely nothing with his life. He had technically graduated high school, but instead of moving forward, he spent his days lazing around while my parents made endless excuses for him. He just needs time to figure things out, my mom would say whenever anyone questioned why he wasn't doing anything. Meanwhile, I was doing everything I could to ensure I didn't end up like him, stuck in our small town, suffocated by excuses and false hope. By winter, the acceptance letters started arriving. I remember the first one vividly. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the envelope in my trembling hands. The return address read University of Oregon. I had applied to colleges all over the country, but this one was nearly 2,000 miles away. It represented everything I wanted: freedom, a fresh start, a life far from here. My heart pounded as I opened the envelope. The words "Congratulations" felt like gold. I had gotten in. For the first time in years, I could finally breathe. That letter wasn't just an acceptance, it was my freedom. I clutched it like a lifeline, but I didn't tell my parents right away. I was terrified of how they'd react. I waited until after dinner one quiet night to break the news. "Mom, Dad," I said, standing in the doorway of the living room where they were watching TV. I got accepted to a university. My mom glanced up with a distracted smile. "That's great, honey. Which one?" "The University of Oregon," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm going to move there for school." The room fell silent. My dad muted the TV and turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "Oregon," he repeated. "That's across the country." "I know," I said. "That's where I want to go." My mom's smile faltered. "But why would you go that far? There are perfectly good schools here in Missouri. And we can't afford out-of-state tuition." "I've applied for scholarships," I said quickly. "And I've been saving up. I can make it work." My dad shook his head. "Mallory, this is ridiculous. You don't need to go that far just to get a degree. Think about Brendan. You know how much he relies on you." There it was again. Brendan. It was always about Brendan. My voice sharpened before I could stop it. "He doesn't rely on me. You rely on me to deal with him." My dad's expression hardened. "You're being selfish. Brendan's going through a hard time and you want to run away? What kind of sister does that?" "A sister who's tired," I snapped, my voice rising. "A sister who's spent her whole life being ignored because of him." "Mallory," my mom gasped, looking at me like I'd just cursed at them. I couldn't hold it in anymore. "You've spent my entire life making excuses for him. He's mean, he's cruel, and you act like it's my job to put up with it. It's not. I deserve to have a life too. I deserve to matter." My dad opened his mouth to argue, but he didn't have the words. My mom started crying. "We've always done our best for you. How can you say that?" I shook my head, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. "If this is your best, then it's not enough. I'm going, and you can't stop me." I left the room before they could respond, retreating to my bedroom where I sat on my bed and let the tears fall. I didn't want to feel guilty for wanting more, but it was impossible not to. My entire life, I had been made to feel like my needs were an inconvenience, like wanting to be seen was selfish. But this time, I wasn't backing down. The next morning, my parents tried a softer approach. My mom sat next to me at the kitchen table, her voice gentle. "Mallory, we're just worried about you moving so far away. It's a big decision." "I know," I said firmly, "but I need to do this." "What about us?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What about Brendan?" I looked her in the eye and said the words I had been holding in for years. "I'm not responsible for Brendan. I never was." Her face froze, like the idea had never even occurred to her. My dad wasn't as gentle. That evening, he cornered me in the hallway. "If you leave," he said coldly, "don't expect us to help you. You're on your own." I met his gaze without flinching. "I've always been on my own," I said. The next few months were brutal. My parents barely spoke to me unless they had to, and Brendan went out of his way to make my life miserable. He seemed to sense that he was losing control over me. One night, he blocked my bedroom door, towering over me with that smug smirk of his. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" he sneered. "I think I deserve better," I shot back. I shoved past him, my heart pounding, but I refused to let him see my fear. He didn't get to win anymore. As graduation approached, I started packing in secret. I didn't want Brendan to destroy anything or my parents to sabotage my plans. My grandparents, Evelyn and George, were my lifeline during those months. They let me store my bags at their house and promised to help with the move. "You're doing the right thing, Mallory," Grandpa said one afternoon as we sat at their kitchen table. "It's not wrong to want more for yourself." The day I left was eerily quiet. I had arranged to stay with my grandparents for the summer before heading to Oregon. My parents barely acknowledged my departure. My mom gave me a stiff hug, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't say a word. My dad didn't even look at me. Brendan didn't bother coming out of his room. I thought I'd feel sad, maybe even angry, but I didn't. As I loaded my bags into Grandpa's car, I felt nothing but freedom. That summer, I worked harder than ever, saving every dollar I could. My grandparents were incredible, letting me stay rent-free and even helping with some of my first semester expenses. They told me how proud they were of me, and for once, I believed them. When the day finally came to leave for Oregon, Grandpa drove me to the airport. At the gate, he gave me one of his signature pep talks. "You've got a whole life ahead of you, Mallory," he said, his voice steady and warm. "Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't deserve it." I hugged him tightly, tears stinging my eyes. "Thank you," I whispered. As the plane took off, I looked out the window at the ground below. I felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. For the first time in my life, I was free. I didn't know what awaited me in Oregon, but I knew one thing for certain. I was never going back to that house or that life. For the first time, my future felt like it was mine, and that was enough to keep me moving forward. Arriving in Oregon felt like stepping onto another planet. Everything was new, the air, the people, the city skyline. I had spent so many years dreaming about leaving that it felt surreal to finally be there. For the first few days, I wandered around campus in a daze, overwhelmed by how far I was from everything I had ever known. But despite the excitement, it wasn't easy. I had no safety net. My parents hadn't given me a dime, and even if I wanted to, I knew I couldn't rely on them. My grandparents had helped me get to Oregon, and I owed them everything, but I wasn't going to ask them for more than they had already given. I was truly on my own. I found a job at a small diner near campus, taking the late-night shifts that no one else wanted. I balanced a full-course load with 30-hour work weeks, just to keep a roof over my head and pay for textbooks. There were nights I stumbled back to my tiny dorm room so exhausted I could barely move, but none of that mattered. It was mine, my life, my choices, my freedom. The hardest part was realizing how unprepared I was for the real world. Growing up in survival mode had left me without basic life skills. I didn't know how to manage money, cook, or even ask for help when I needed it. I felt like a kid in a room full of adults who seemed to have their lives together. Other students talked about going home for the holidays, calling their parents for advice, or getting help when they were short on cash. I had none of that. At first, I felt like I didn't belong. I wasn't the smartest student in the room, and I definitely wasn't the most put together. My clothes were secondhand, my textbooks were stained with coffee, and I never had enough time to study as much as I wanted. But what I lacked in resources, I made up for with sheer determination. I had spent years being invisible, years being told I was second to someone else's needs. I wasn't about to give up now. Slowly, I found my rhythm. I made a few close friends, people who didn't know about my past and didn't expect me to carry the weight of someone else's problems. They liked me for who I was, not for what I could do for them. For the first time in my life, I felt truly seen. One of my friends, Claire, would sit with me in the dining hall between classes, laughing and talking about everything and nothing. She didn't realize how much those little moments meant to me. Still, at night, when everything was quiet, I couldn't help but think about home. I wondered if my parents missed me, or if Brendan even noticed I was gone. There were moments when the silence hurt more than I wanted to admit. Sometimes I thought about calling them just to see if they'd pick up. But then I remembered all the years they ignored me and allowed Brendan to make my life miserable. The first few months passed quickly, and before I knew it, winter break arrived. While other students packed their bags to go home, I stayed on campus. I had nowhere to go. My grandparents called to check on me, and I reassured them I was fine, even though I spent most of the break feeling lonelier than I ever had. I worked extra shifts at the diner to keep busy, and when the new semester started, I threw myself back into my studies. Over time, things began to change. I started to feel proud of myself. Every test I aced, every grueling double shift I survived, it all felt like a victory. Every dollar I saved and every paper I turned in on time was proof that I could survive on my own. Slowly but surely, I stopped wondering if my parents would ever call, or waiting for an apology that would never come. It hurt to admit it, but they had made their choice when I left. They had chosen Brendan, and I had chosen myself. Nearly a year later, I finally heard from home. My grandma called one evening. She rarely called unless it was important, so I knew something was wrong. "Mallory, your parents are having a rough time," she said gently. "Brendan's been acting out worse than ever." "What happened?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know.
She sighed.
"Apparently, he's been causing trouble in the neighborhood. Your parents finally got a wake-up call when the police got involved. He was yelling at some kids and throwing things at them. One of the parents called the police, and he was arrested." I was stunned. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me felt relief. Maybe now my parents would finally see that Brendan's behavior wasn't something they could keep excusing. But another part of me felt sad. Brendan had spent his whole life acting like the world owed him something, and now it had finally caught up with him. "What did my parents do?" I asked. "They bailed him out, of course," Grandma said. "But the court ordered him to start therapy. Your parents are struggling to pay for it. Your mom mentioned it to me the other day, and I think they're hoping to reach out to you soon." My stomach dropped. I hadn't spoken to my parents in over a year, and I had no desire to be dragged back into their mess. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her not to expect you to fix everything," Grandma said firmly. "You've done enough, Mallory. It's not your responsibility." Her words brought tears to my eyes. She understood what my parents never could. I had spent my whole life carrying burdens that weren't mine. I wasn't going to do it anymore. A few days later, the call I had been dreading finally came. My dad's number popped up on my phone screen, and for a moment I almost didn't answer. But against my better judgment, I picked up. "Hello," I said cautiously. "Mallory, it's Dad," he said. His voice sounded older, more tired than I remembered. "How are you?" I didn't know how to answer that coming from him. "I'm fine," I said flatly. "What do you want?" He sighed, clearly disappointed by my tone. "Your mom and we've been talking. We think it's time to put everything behind us. We miss you, Mallory. We want to make things right." I stayed silent, waiting for the real reason he was calling. Sure enough, he continued. "The truth is, Brendan's struggling. He's been in trouble, and we're trying to get him the help he needs, but it's expensive. We thought maybe, since you're doing well now, you could pitch in a little. Just until we get back on our feet. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. After all this time, after years of ignoring me, they were only reaching out because they wanted something. I gripped the phone tightly.
No.
Mallory, come on, he pleaded. You know how hard this has been for us. I don't care, I snapped. I'm not responsible for Brendan, and I'm not going to save you from the mess you created. You chose to ignore everything he did, and now you're dealing with the consequences. That's not my problem. Before he could say another word, I hung up. My hands were shaking, but I felt lighter than I had in years. For the first time, I had stood my ground. That night, my mom sent me a long text full of apologies and promises to do better. I didn't respond. I had spent my entire childhood waiting for them to change, and they never had. I wasn't going to fall for it now. I wasn't angry anymore, I was free.